I think it's a really important initiative to start thinking about not only the theoretical aspects of urban governance regarding culture, but also the practical and political issues surrounding how to support our local cities and municipalities in this area that we, as we all know from the work that we do, is sorely needed. And bringing together this sort of collective wisdom of this group is an attempt to begin that process.
Thank you so much, Avril. And again, thank you all for attending. I'm going to be speaking twice, but the first part is just to talk about the network that we're forming, and just to give you kind of a background about what it's about and why. You know, we're calling it temporarily either local urban cultural governance network. Why are we setting up this network? I'm sure most of you would be interested. The network is framed around the concept that culture is not about art or heritage. It does include that, but it's actually the broader concept of culture as values, norms, beliefs, knowledges, and creativities. And it really responds to the idea in the Charter for Human Rights that every citizen has a right to exercise their cultural right to participate in the cultural life of their choice. And we need to recognize that such issues are often exercised at a local level. Then the other point is that urban settlements, cities, towns, etc., are culturally made. They're made by people who come with a whole set of values, beliefs, etc., and their creativity and knowledge is brought to play in the making of that city. For those reasons, cultural knowledge and resources are very important for local development, but are not often thought about in these terms. So the South African government is stuck in an outdated paradigm. And when I'll go through this, you'll see what I mean. So the challenge of working in this outdated paradigm is that culture is often located in local government, very low in the influential chain with very little power or resources. It's often conflated with art or entertainment. It's often becomes stuck in arts funding issues because the art funding demands are loud, but they're rarely listened to. And heritage becomes about built fabric and environment at the local legislation level. So you'll often find, but not always, a separation between the arts and culture side and the heritage side in certain departments. It's not the case in Johannesburg. It's seen as an unfunded mandate because it's not in the constitution. And as a result, it's often used as a political football. And often money is placed into so-called social cohesion events or used for ribbon cutting. So there's a lack of discourse about it. And this lack of discourse is not just at a local level, but also at a national level. And we find a very weak policy framework, intergovernmental arrangements around it. But we are seeing some positive changes because the white paper on arts, culture, and heritage, which Avril was very involved with, has a section on local government. And it's partially Avril's doing that this is there. But the challenge is still about trained professionals and the implementation of this concept because it's not spoken about much at a national level. There's a whole range of issues about it. And then there's essentialized urban-rural debates that often happen, which I'm not going to go into now. So the other point is that there's a role for non-state actors to play in urban cultural governance. And participation is key to the idea of sustainable, inclusive, and just cities. And this is more so in South Africa than anywhere else because our cities are facing significant challenges even before COVID. And urban policy documents have noted the need for more active citizenry. And this is particularly strong in the Kochte reports that exist on integrated urban development frameworks. So why a local cultural governance network? It really responds to the lack of shared discourse. The field of urban cultural policy is very new. It's not very well understood. But it also links to the challenges of implementation of culture at a city level. And we must recognize it's a very new field for most cities. The first city in South Africa that had any kind of cultural department was Johannesburg in 1991. And there's a strong need to engage non-state actors in city making and change. So the idea is for a voluntary mutual support network of individuals working in a variety of disciplines and fields. And the notion is that it's a platform for networking, dialogue, research, and advocacy to develop a shared agenda for working towards inclusive, sustainable, generative, and just cities and towns in South Africa. And it's it's not, there is precedence for this kind of concept. The idea of people joining together and responding to culture at a local level, and we find examples in Canada and Australia where volunteer-driven organizations have become the main point of entry for even local governments for training, for support, etc., around the use of culture for city change. And I think these are useful case studies. They've been around for at least a decade, each of them. So why and how the local cultural governance network as a non-representational network? So you see, we're speaking about individuals. And the idea is that there are individuals in the state who are interested in these areas, but don't have others to support them or learn from. And it's not about necessarily having representational kind of support for this thing. It's about individuals who are going to make change. And it's based, the idea is based very much on the epistemic communities notion that Edgar Peterson, who's the professor at African Center for Cities, has been forwarding around ideas of learning communities, and often around quite radical ideas of sustainable, inclusive cities and how these can be achieved. And he's done some incredible work more recently in Cape Town with the Integration Syndicate, where he's brought together individuals from government, from civil society, etc., to work towards ideas of change. So the idea is that local cultural governance network would be individuals orientated in a range of fields, both in the state and outside, but in a non-representational manner. So, it's really quite a wide variety of people. These are just some that I've mentioned. And the development field obviously is quite broad. It could be everything from gender to environmental issues, et cetera, et cetera. So there's quite a broad range of people that we are thinking about, and it's individuals in that space, not necessarily in the state. So there are 2 draft documents that have been drawn up to help guide the network. These are kind of we will be discussing them over the year, and it's really to help hold the organization, as it were, together until a formal constitution is set up. There are 2 documents. The memorandum of understanding is the what and the why, and the terms of reference, which is the how. And it's based on the International Climate Heritage Network approach. So I'm very thankful for having that to draw on. The idea of the local cultural governance network is very much framed around the idea of culture in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals, and especially a call by the #Culture 2030 goal grouping, which hopefully Jordi will speak about. By the end of the session, you'll get some understanding about what this culture and sustainable development means, and why this agenda is happening at the international level, and why this grouping of 7 organizations have started to pull together. So there are 2 more slides I have, but I'm not going to talk about them now, and I'll talk about them after we've had some discussion about possible ways forward with the network.
I think you've laid out very carefully and very, very concisely the motivation for wanting to set up this network, the kinds of practitioners and academics and people that you think should be in it, and some of the key priority areas that you are talking about.
The United Cities and local government, which has been focused on the connection between culture and sustainable development through a committee, the Culture Committee, since 2004. And in the last few years has now started to focus very heavily on questions of sustainable development goals, especially in the global agenda. So I think we all know what sustainable development is. We all talk about the triple bottom line. And the question of sustainable development has really come up from 1987, from the Brundtland report, which really, it's a definition that we all have seen before around economic, environmental, and social. But more recently, there's been unprecedented urgent challenges which have emerged that people have started to talk about more in greater detail. And the first one is man-made climate change and ecological destruction. And it's quite significant. And I think from the South African perspective, it's not taken terribly seriously. I'm sure most of us would agree. And that there are significant direct consequences. We felt it in places like Durban with major storms. We felt it in Cape Town with water shortages. But it has a lot of indirect consequences as a result of these consequences of climate change and ecological destruction, which really impact on how humans live and their environment, their supportive environment being maintained. And these are significant issues in many parts of the world, as many of you have seen. But the other key point has been around high and growing levels of inequality, which is often the impacts of colonialism, rampant capitalism, corruption, oppressive states, etc. Now, these two kind of become almost tensions in how people think, because on one hand, it's related to the green agenda. On the other hand, there is a brown agenda at play, which is the more urgent issues. And these tensions are complex. And in the South African context, we find that the brown agenda tends to be the point that people focus on because we have such immediate human local issues. It impacts on a very large percentage of our population, the majority of our people. But the ways in which these two talk to each other are not easy because they have very different kinds of timings and scales, etc. So it's often a point that gets, in the South African context, I find pushed down the line because it's seen as something, an either or situation. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals, I think, tries to balance these brown and green issues. And it does so quite interestingly, and I don't think there's been a lot of discussion about this, particularly in the cultural sector. And we talk about sustainable cultural sector issues, but I don't think we're talking about it in the broader sense of what it means for society. Now, the problem has often been that people have conflated the SDGs with the MDGs. And the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, were very much a kind of top-down program. It was about poverty. It was about developing countries. The SDG is much broader. It has 17 goals. It has 169 targets. It's bottom up, and it's come from an unprecedented consultation process at the global level. It's universal. 193 countries, which is all of the UN, has signed it, including North Korea. And it impacts on the entire world's population. And it covers these three dimensions of sustainable development, but it tries to be an inclusive approach to development. So every country which has signed up to it has got targets to meet the 2030 kind of time frame that people have said, if we don't sort out some of our issues, we're in serious problem. And South Africa is one of those signatories. And these commitments are made at both at a very kind of at a national level, but also regional and local level. And reporting is meant to be done every year on these issues. Now, at the UCLG, the concept of localizing the SDGs has become very important. And localizing is about making the concepts relevant at a local level, but also recognizing how these concepts relate to agendas that are set at a national or local level, and how the connection can be made so that people can understand how to take forward an agenda. You know, so I won't go through an example, but there's various ways in which different people speak about sustainable development in different parts of the world, but actually they might not use those words, but they're speaking about the same thing. So the other point is to recognize that the sustainable development agenda is very much at a urban level, because so many people are located in cities. And I mean, the world is rapidly becoming urbanized despite COVID. And I think even when COVID is gone, the point is people congregate in cities because it's where opportunities are. As Ban Ki-moon has indicated when he was UN Secretary General, the struggle will be lost and won in cities. So the Sustainable Development Goals provides a great framework to work with the idea of development in an integrated way. Now, culture is not explicitly mentioned in the SDGs except in 10 instances. And it's expressed around hunger, around indigenous seeds, around education. Number 4.7, these are the different in the 169 goals, around cultural jobs and work, around sustainable tourism. The strongest focus is on cities under 11.4, heritage, public spaces, around, again, sustainable tourism, around sustainable consumption and production. And then in peace, justice, and institutions around stolen artifacts, but very importantly, participatory governance, and also info access to info and access and freedoms. So the international goals, I'm not sure if Jordi is here yet, Avril. I don't know if you've
No, he's not. He's
not yet. Okay, so the international, at the international level, the 7 lead networks, including UCLG, has got together to fight for the inclusion of culture within the SDGs. They haven't been successful. They've tried at every attempt to do it. So what they've started doing is focusing on how to mainstream culture in the global development agenda. And so they continue for the fight to place it strongly in the UN agenda, but they're also looking at different ways to get different sectors of society to recognize the importance of culture as a goal that should be taken seriously in the 2030 development agenda. So there are a number of tools that have been developed for this, and UCLG is just one of many cultural organizations. UNESCO has as well taken on the issue of culture in its relationship to 2030. And there's some really incredible practical tools that have been developed, and we'll discuss one of those shortly. So what does it mean to have culture in the SDGs? I'm going to talk about the one tool, which is this culture in the Sustainable Development Goals, a guide for local action, which is a UCLG document. And I think it's a very helpful document because people often ask me, can you be more practical? What does culture in the context of a city mean? I don't understand. And people in South Africa tend to, on the whole, fall back on arts, entertainment, heritage, but it's much broader. So I think this guide is very helpful, but it's not just in the South African context that we struggle with these things. I recently did a workshop in Zimbabwe, in Bulawayo, and it was the same issue. The local government there also struggles to make the connection between culture and SDGs. So the document is really helpful, and it's very simple. It was distributed to all of you. It's organized in 4 ways. The first is the theme. It speaks about the goal and how that goal can be understood in a simple way. Second, it speaks to how culture is relevant. And it really takes into account a whole range of cultural aspects that are significant for the achievement of the goal. And it makes very explicit a reference to the 2030 agenda. The next section is about what can cities do, and it provides very tangible recommendations to local government based on quite a lot of research that's been done since 2003 internationally, and looks at the links between culture and other policies, programs, and practices. And then the last point is how cities can make this effective, and it uses examples. So it presents an evidence base from cities around the world about how they've used culture in sustainable developments to achieve relevant goals. So it takes, I'm not going to go through each of these goals, but basically the document will take every single one of the goal and break it down. And this breakdown is done in very simple ways. It's usually one or two pages. This is the goal on water, for example. So here it explains what the SDG is about. It talks about why culture is relevant. In this case, it's about traditional knowledge and the lessons learned towards appropriate sustainable use of water-related ecosystems. The other is what can cities do to take that forward. And the last one is how can cities make this effective? And it uses two examples in this case about projects that are done in cities around water. These different good practices. And I know a lot of people don't like good practice as a concept, but it's about what cities have done using culture for sustainable development. And it has an extensive database, which is free to use in English, French, and Spanish. And it takes each of the goals, and you can, click one of the goals, and you can ask yourself, in what way does it speak to goal 16 around participation? And it will show you a range of different examples around the world, how cities, because these are examples put together by cities from their municipalities about what they're doing. And you can look at commitments. These are cultural commitments that are proposed by UCLG Culture Committee, and they talk to a whole range of issues, or just look at it from a keyword perspective. From a South African perspective, I know there's 2 case studies on there, definitely. The one from Cape Town on the cultural policy that was developed in 2014, and the other around Johannesburg's carnival. So these are just a short kind of way in which they're spoken about in the main document. But if you go into the database, there is an extensive write-up on each of these cities. And each of the cities puts forward this extensive write-up to a call that's made through the Mexico Award, which is the 4th international. We've had the 4th international one last year or the year before, I can't remember now. And there's whoever puts forward case studies that are accepted are put onto the database. So as a result of this, the database is quite rich. And then just lastly on UCLG does a range of programs to support culture and sustainable cities. UCLG is United Cities and Local Government, if I didn't say that earlier. And it's a kind of international UN for cities, and every city belongs to it in some form or the other. So other than the kind of culture, the pilot cities program that it runs and the lead cities, it also runs a regular workshop now called the 7 Keys, which is a way to get people to understand at a municipal level what culture means for their cities.
I think it was useful that you went through the whole document and how it's laid out. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we could populate each of those goals with South African examples, even if they're not the best examples, but they're the ones we've got. So without taking conversation yet, let's have our 2 key respondents, and then we're going to open it up. So I hope you just keeping notes about the things you want to comment on or ask questions about or whatever afterwards. But let's first have Rike. So Rike Sitas is from the African Center for Cities, and I think you all know her CV, but in case you don't, she straddles the academic world of urban studies and creative practice. She's fascinated by the intersection of art, culture, and heritage in urban life, and in particular the role that these can play in realizing a more just and sustainable cities. She's written extensively I'll encourage you to read some of her work. You can find it on African Center for Cities website, which is where she's based. She's also a fellow of the Center for Humanities Research at UWC, and a large part of her interest involves unpacking the notion of public space and public life in cities, particularly in the Global South, paying particular attention to rethinking culture-based development and cultural policy in African cities. Rike, it's wonderful to have you here. Over to you.
Thanks so much for inviting me to respond and to take part in this conversation. I think I share a lot of the interests in trying to think through how we can think strategically about culture and what that means for urban development, for sustainability, for justice, for all these interconnected things. And a lot of the work that I've been doing at ACC has been trying to make sense of this, what it kind of means to take art, culture, heritage more seriously in urban agendas. So Zayd asked me to start by talking a little bit about the critiques and the risks, because because I think there are some risks that we need to take into consideration. So, I mean, one of the things around the SDGs, oh, here we go. I think it's coming up now, is that, well, policies move, right? They have a sense of mobility and agility themselves. They appear in localized policy documents all the time. And even though they're visible, they do run a risk of perhaps even just providing check boxes that people can just tick against what they're already doing. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there's new generative stuff happening. They also often are undercosted or uncosted or undercosted. And when we've got fiscally constrained cities, they often unimplementable. So even the most progressive policies and the most interesting policies, and I'm sure, Zayd, you have experience from this in terms of the Cape Town policy, is that they become very difficult to implement in some ways. And so what do we do about those kinds of things? There's also contradictions between between national agendas and local agendas. The idea of the imperative of national unity and a particular kind of identity with very localized specificities, and what do we do with that? And also there comes a risk is that a lot of the people making decisions don't necessarily come from any background that comes from rooted in cultural interests or issues, which I think links to that kind of that conceptual clarity, Zayd, that you were talking about before. That and you were mentioning how art and culture get conflated, but there's a strange relationship between art, culture, and heritage that is not really very well articulated, and they merge and then they get taken apart, and they result in a whole bunch of things that can end up being quite problematic or confusing, especially for people who are not within the cultural sector. Also, I mean, culture is incredibly sticky. It gets stuck to everything, and people use it and channel it for all sorts of weird and wonderful purposes, but also some really dangerous and divisive purposes, which you can see in the xenophobic violence, the rise of the right wing. So we need to be cautious of these kinds of things. And we also stuck with some very limited economic arguments. I think Zayd mentioned the kind of events-based tourism, but there's a lot of the time this elite-centric tourism, producing an entire industry around an external audience. We've seen how that's crashed majorly in terms of COVID, when your entire industry is not based on locals. And so there's some tensions and trade-offs that happen in that kind of economic argument. They're also the same with elite economy cultural industries, which can end up being extractive and create a political economy that largely just creates menial jobs, as opposed to really thinking through structural change, which is, I think, what the SDGs and what these global commitments are trying to do. But unfortunately, often they just replicate the same kinds of unequal value chains and problematic work relationships. And then we often see the kind of risks around and the challenges around the imbalance between the tangible and intangible. And it's much easier to make sense of something that's there, something's physical material that we can see in front of us, whereas a lot of the meaning and values are in the tangible, intangible relationships. Also, I mean, we've seen how colonial architecture gets often gets colonial architecture and institutions then become the things that are valued, or those are the things that are protected because they're so much easier to see, and they've got very, very strong lobby groups behind them. I mean, the number of cannons around the Cape that have a very big, strong, protected lobby groups behind them. And then, I mean, there's also the kind of conflating natural and cultural and foregrounding the built environment over and above other kinds of things. Zayd, can you go on to the next slide, please? But I think, I mean, if we really think of city making as a cultural act from the very beginning, we make the assumptions around the kinds of urban planning, development come from social, cultural, and aesthetic assumptions. And even if this is not explicit, this is really why cities and how cities are built. And that's why we feel comfortable in some neighborhoods and uncomfortable in others. So we need to take that seriously. The second one is we often if we think about our decisions are made and informed by cultural and social biases and desires. And these aren't always healthy. I mean, if we all think about it, we've probably ingested something in the last 24 hours that was not good for us. So there's a kind of strange rationality to it that comes from particular kinds of cultural-based decisions. And yeah, even the most banal decisions can be cut through with politics. I mean, if you Google image punch-ups in Parliament, you can see that even the most formal political places have things, have a kind of an emotional and cultural texture to it. So yeah, this means we need to take culture more seriously. And aside from the risks and limitations and the critiques and limitations, what we're sitting with is a global commitment to the SDGs, to the UCLG's Culture 21, to the African Union's Agenda 2063. And I think there's a powerful commitment to that, where we have an opportunity to hold authorities accountable and to really use them in a way to connect the social, the spatial, the cultural, the ecological, the economic in new and interesting ways. And I think this is where a network like this is really important in order to kind of really fuel that and to bring those kinds of questions into the discussion. And you've mentioned the different policy, the cases that are involved. And I think it's really, I think what the UCLG document does very well is give those cases and give those links to other kinds of projects. And although we run the risk of replication, because sometimes things that are outside are seen as much more sexy as things that are happening here, they do give a set of arguments in order to bolster what we're trying to do. So the next slide, please, Zayd. We do need better arguments, right? Because we can see that we have not won the argument yet. We have not entirely won the fact that culture needs to be strategically seen as core to any kind of development, sustainable, or justice agenda. So we need these kind of arguments, better arguments for circular economies that take the formal and informal into consideration. We need the instrumentalization of culture for addressing social inequality just beyond the kind of lip service to social cohesion. And it's not really an either or, it's both. It needs to be based on issues of democracy, equity, and justice. But in order to do this, and I think, Avril, you just mentioned that, we need better evidence and empirical cases. So the UCLG does it incredibly well, and I think it can give an idea of what is necessary here. But like what you said, I think I'm also curious, what does it look like? What would a South African repository of those examples look like? And so we need a more coherent database and archives and essentially more local experimentation in order to create some of this stuff. And this is kind of needed in order to win the argument with people who have historically not been sympathetic or do not see culture as cross-cutting factor in sustainability and justice. Often it's seen as this wishy-washy stuff when we're dealing with water and sanitation and electricity. What is this culture stuff that everybody's obsessing about? So, and I think we're really starting to do it and kind of really putting it together. We can see, how this can play out. So the last thing, and I'll try and do it. We need kind of evidence-based strategic decision-making. The last thing I'd just like to briefly mention, I see my colleagues from the city of Cape Town in the room, in the Zoom room as well, is that we've been trying to we've got this, let me take a step back. So a project of the African Centre for Cities is the Knowledge Transfer Program, and that involves embedding researchers within the city of Cape Town to work on a variety of different issues, from climate change to the green economy, to transport, to localizing the SDGs, and also in the arts and culture branch. And it's a process of really setting up an embedded, action-oriented research process that is filled with co-production, and the idea of trying to think through some of these difficult things. What's nice about having embedded researchers is that they might have a little bit more dexterity within the city than city officials may be able to say the things that people aren't allowed to say or might get fired for saying because they're slightly autonomous. And so it's been quite an interesting process of what happens when you have these kinds of partnerships, and what does it mean for really looking at bringing in some evidence base from outside and also creating new evidence base for decisions in the city. So one of the things that's come out of this is we've been trying to pull it all together into some kind of reflective note, and try and do a little bit of this and find a way of communicating it more clearly. So next slide, please. Just to give a very, very quick intro on what we're doing. It's kind of a work in progress and coming out soon, hopefully, is thinking about how we can pinpoint strategic position of culture and linking it to environmental sustainability, social sustainability and well-being, and livelihoods and innovation, which at the moment are kind of buzzwords that are floating around the world and in the city, and obviously in the city of Cape Town. What does it mean? What does it look like? What are the tangible actions that can happen around it? And that this needs to be enabled by a creative and cross-cutting governance, which I think is often mentioned in the creative cities discourse, that it's not just about bolstering cultural industries, it's really about thinking of about innovations in the governance systems itself, which is, I think, also a role that this network can play, is what does that actually mean in terms of governance systems. And I'll just show the last slide because it's a summary of how we've been kind of thinking about it. It's really lots of information on one slide, but we've been trying to figure out what are the kinds of connecting it to the SDGs, connecting it to the IDP, connecting it to various different strategies within the city. What is already happening, initiated by the city of Cape Town, that can provide the evidence base for this? So, for example, under people and participation, what kinds of methods and modes is the city already using in order to do this? And the cultural mapping and planning and impact assessment, cultural mapping and planning work is really, there's already this project that's happening in the city, which I think Shamila is there. You can talk more about it a little bit later if there's space. And this needs to be anchored in processes and programs where the kind of the investment in cultural investment can't just end in delivery of hard infrastructure. It needs to have programs in place. And one of the examples we use is the case of Langa, where the cultural mapping and planning has resulted in a series of activities and civic organizing around activities. And then, places and planets connecting natural and cultural environments, and then also the tangible and intangible heritage. And this also means addressing issues of land, of disputes, of displacement, and new place identities. And the example we use there is museum collaborations, like what happens when you pull these different kinds of museums together. Policies and partnerships really looks at what kind of strategic positioning of culture can happen in relation to other strategies and objectives, being opportunistic across sectors, and thinking about how you make arguments, for example, about culture as a service, as part of a service delivery, so bringing culture into the infrastructure debate and infrastructural service delivery. What are the kinds of cultural and social deliveries that are needed? And which obviously links to the planning and public finance, better use of the finance. If we're sitting with, there's a lot of money floating around in government for arts, culture, heritage, for these activities, but it's not necessarily coherent, and it's often, gets sucked into all sorts of very expensive projects. So what are the other better uses of resources, and connecting it to other socio-cultural objectives in planning? And the examples from Cape Town as a collaboration between the spatial development unit and the arts and culture branch around Janoon, and around kind of inserting that stuff there, and also in District 6. And finally, what this really involves is thinking about politics and political will, and the role of governance being incredibly key. So not only internally, but creating platforms, what Zayd, you were talking about, for stronger civil society and distributed governance. What does it mean to tell and ask a government to stop doing things and to move away and to step out and actually get out of the way entirely That's, you know, that's not what often the impulse is of policies and strategies. And yeah, I guess what I mentioned before about leveraging the Creative Cities network, looking across those kinds of exemplars that are happening. And maybe my final point is how these can link to accountability, that all of this can build the kinds of accountability and transparency that is needed. And that actually particular kinds of quite bold decisions need to be made by cities, which are not happening at the moment. If development is based on real estate trajectories and on gathering finances through real estate, then you can have a very particular kind of effect, which is going to mean that culture sits in particular ways. And I know the Medellin example is used a lot, but there was a mayor who made a decision to take social development as the core and then to build everything around it. So what are the kinds of, what are how this network could then perhaps put some provocations and propositions on the table for some of those bold moves that municipalities can make, because they're small incremental things, but what would it take in order to kind of rethink poverty, rethink sustainability through a cultural lens that has the kinds of impacts and effects that we're wanting to see, that are just, that are equitable, that, you know, do all of the stuff that we have been hoping to see in our cities for a very long time that haven't come yet to fruition. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rike. That was fabulous sort of exposition of I think quite important set of priorities that could be taken up by the network, in fact. And I really liked your very full diagram because I think it outlines, you know, all the key relevant issues that need to be taken into account. And I also like the idea of, you know, how could this network support cities and municipalities to think about a set of bold decisions. It's a nice idea. Bold decisions that are not huge, are not very costly, but will change the way they thinking about the problem and thinking about the sets of solutions. And I mean, you know, you're absolutely right about the problem with government is that they think they have to do it themselves. And getting them out of the way is going to be, I think, one of the hardest challenges in our country, where government believes it is the bearer and the custodian and the final implementer of everything. And if they don't do it, they're simply not doing their job. The fact that they don't do their job seems to be a little bit irrelevant, but their belief is that they ought to be doing that. And I think it's come up in so many places around culture and cultural industries as well, even in provincial government and in national government, you know, even in doing the white paper, just very quickly to say, you know, we asked national government, why are you also running festivals when you have an agency that distributes money for people who want to run festivals? Why are you then also running the festival? You are competing with the sector. Said, oh, we need things to talk about in our budget vote. It was as simple as that. And I said, yes, but you can speak about what your agencies do. You have 26 agencies. You could list everything they do in your budget vote, and that's what you do because they're your agencies. Oh, never thought about it like that. So often it's not even a malicious intent. It's simply a lack of understanding of what is the role of a national government, which is about strategy and policy and monitoring and evaluation. It's not about doing it. It's not about running the festival and organizing the conference. And, you know, that extends all the way down to local government. So I think those are very important considerations. But just to say, we welcome Jordi Pascual. Lovely to see you, Jordi. Thanks for being here. I understand that the timing got confused, but it's wonderful to have you. So before we come back to you, I'm going to ask Stephen Sack to respond to the first set of presentations that Zayd made. And what I say about Stephen has been around the block a few times. He was the Director of Arts, Culture and Heritage at City of Joburg. I met Stephen when he was working as a director. I'm not even sure what its title was in the national government when we were doing the cultural industry growth strategy, and he worked on Carnival and all sorts of interesting things when he was in national government, and he fundamentally was able to access budgets that were not meant for arts and culture, such as a poverty alleviation budget, and use it to support and stimulate a whole bunch of craft initiatives in rural communities. Stephen, I know that there was something about that Zayd had sent round. I don't have access to it right now, but I know you're also director of Funda Art Center, which remains one of our premier bodies that of arts, political expression and political space that really sort of incubated some of our best known artists in South Africa. And you are now an independent consultant working mainly on everything. I think not mainly on anything, but on everything, museums and heritage and culture and cultural industries.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm actually in Johannesburg. We've been locked out in Cape Town for most of the COVID time. And it sort of feels appropriate that I'm in Johannesburg, because it feels like I've got to talk about what's happening at the local level in Johannesburg in response as the framing for my engagement with what the really, really very, very useful overview by Zayd, and then this kind of very important work that Rike, it looks like, has been able to do in quite a sustainable way over quite a sustained period with the city of Cape Town. And I don't believe that that is happening now in cities. It was happening particularly around public art and carnival, interestingly enough, a decade or so ago. But right now, in fact, somebody from the city of Cape Town, from their Department of Arts and Culture, got in touch with me, wanting to do some benchmarking and wanting to know who they should talk to in the city of Johannesburg. And I had to kind of just warn them that it might be a futile exercise to benchmark themselves against the city of Johannesburg, unless they were interested in what has happened there historically over a period of 20 years. But right now, it would seem that there's nothing like the engagement with the university that Rike has described with the city of Cape Town. So just as you all recall, Parks Tau was the mayor of the city of Johannesburg and then became the head of the network of mayors and was the president until the ANC lost power in the city of Johannesburg. And I remember him doing a presentation and talking about the conclusion that everyone had arrived at, that the SDGs could never be delivered if they are not delivered through cities, through strong city capability, and that they were looking at new funding instruments to try and get resources to cities to help drive this agenda. So I don't know whatever happened with that, but it would be interesting to know the extent to which that has actually materialized. The other question that I would have for Zayd is, in setting up a network, who are we talking to? And I know that part of the talking to has been an attempt to engage SALGA, the South African Local Government Association. And maybe Zayd can sort of talk about the state of that engagement and whether there's been any fruitful discussion that has come out of that. The other thing that was interesting for the city of Johannesburg was that the Department of Arts and Culture, when I joined the city, was located within a cluster of parks and recreations. It was parks, recreations, arts and culture. And when I came into the city, the scale of that entity actually made it possible for us to make very significant progress. Then post 2008, we were restructured and we were put into community development. And suddenly we had this exploded definition of culture and responsibilities across all 9 regions of the city, and less space and less time to influence the policy making. Remarkably enough, what actually gave us entree was Carnival, because the Carnival program was the only program that managed to unlock new resources. And the reason why was because of the linkage to peace and security in the city around the annual end of New Year's celebration, and the disruption that was happening in the city with crime and violence and antisocial behavior. And so we got the only new money that we ever managed to unlock was for the Carnival program. Very effective, working for a period of about 3 or 4 years with the police department, with community organizations, and with all the regions. And it was so successful that we had officials from sports and recreation rolling out the program on our behalf. And it's a very interesting case study, of course, because of the way in which it then brings cultural identity to the table. In fact, when the province took it up, they wanted their festival to be on Heritage Day and to be a parade of cultural communities. So you'd have, you know, the Shangaan, the Tsonga, the Zulu, the Pedi, the Chinese, you know, that's how they tried to frame the way in which they created this cultural event. So the Carnival is an interesting example and an interesting case study. And then the last thing I want to say, and it's around who the network talks to, is how the network talks to government. And the most recent work that I'm doing is on the gaming and animation industry. We've been doing a big analysis of the ecosystem. And when you start engaging with communities along the NEDLAC kind of notion that you bring to the table in your network, you bring business, you bring labor, you bring community, you bring practitioners, you bring all these people around the table. There has been such an ongoing, relentless failure on the side of government to meet any of the needs. Actually now a perception that the government does more damage to the sector and has actually resulted in attrition of jobs and of businesses because of the terrible policies that are implemented in particular by the Department of Trade and Industry. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how this, and it seems to me that what's happening in Cape Town is interesting because it is a lot easier at the local level. Right now, the new master plan for the culture and creative industries for South Africa goes to 5 different ministries. And the lead is not taken by the Department of Arts and Culture. It seems to be with small business development, DTI are there, communications are there. You know, so it makes it even more complex to engage and lobby when now suddenly you've got 5 ministries all dealing with this. So I think focusing on and using Cape Town Sounds as a case study might be a fertile space. But thanks, that's where I'll stop.
Thanks, Stephen. Also, really a useful set of questioning about who the network would be talking to, and some of the experience of difficulties of running programs inside the city of Joburg. And I think, you know, coming back to the original set of comments about the SDGs might, by focusing through culture, the role or that culture plays in the various SDGs, might be a way to be able to identify many different ministries and many different departments that can be engaged on this topic without feeling that it all has to be under the rubric of Department of Arts and Culture, which, as we know, itself is a beleaguered department right now with a lot of anger and animosity from civil society, and is not seen as the champion of culture at all, of the cultural rights of people, of cultural identity, of even of cultural funding. So I think there are definitely a set of considerations that the network would need to take up.
United Cities and Local Governments, UCLG, the peak global organization, trying to influence the United Nations system on the need to emphasize the cultural dimension of development, and that cultural dimension is extremely meaningful, essential, critical, unavoidable, compulsory when we talk about local development. We use the metaphor of the fourth pillar, and yeah, fourth or first, but a seat at the table. We cannot understand the world today. We cannot understand our cities. We cannot understand ourselves as human beings unless the cultural dimension is explicit. We were born in 2004 in the middle of the, let me be a bit provocative also, in the middle of the bubble of cultural instrumentalization for economic development purposes, mainly real estate, regeneration, and yes, economic. Let me also add that we were born to defend cultural rights, to articulate a global agenda on cultural rights that was useful for local actors, mainly, yes, local governments. Our members in United Cities and Local Governments are local governments, cities and local governments, and provinces and counties and regions. But we also learned that this, say, progress, local progress on cultural rights, mainly the right to participate in cultural life fully and freely by all, therefore with an accent for vulnerable people, identifying obstacles for those people that cannot still participate in that cultural life, knowing that the implementation of those policies, yes, essential the role of local governments, but also, yes, essential the work of civil society. Not easy, because there are not very often coalitions for cultural rights or advocacy coalitions for solid cultural policies, or networks of cultural actors defending their obvious professional interests, but also promoting the rights of all. This is not frequently happening in cities around the world. Very few cities have this kind of local movements. So we were born with that purpose, with lots of difficulties, because UNESCO is not there. UNESCO is mainly still in the instrumentalization of culture paradigm. But in these 15 years, the landscape has changed. For example, the outstanding work of the two special rapporteurs on cultural rights, Farida Shahid from 2009 to 2015, and today Karima Ben Noun from 2016 to 2021, has done outstanding work explaining what cultural rights mean and how they can be implemented nationally, locally, internationally also. So the scenario is changing, and if there is something we are proud of, is that we have contributed to influence that global conversation on culture and development, and we have tried to put, yes, cultural rights at the center. We have tried to not only put an emphasis in the theories, the frames, the fourth pillar, and our declaration, Agenda 21 for Culture, but we have tried to implement it with specific tools, with these Culture 21 actions that we approved in 2015, with 9 commitments and 100 actions, 100 questions that we pose to local governments and to cultural actors. Not all the questions are aiming to influence or to challenge, to support, of course, local governments, but also cultural actors. And I will finish here. We have tried also to connect cultural rights, our metaphors, our tools with the SDGs. And here I connect with something that Zayd also asked us to develop, the Culture 2030 Goal Coalition. And in 2013, we were successful in May 2013 when UNESCO approved the Hangzhou Declaration in 2013, May 2013. We asked to work together to have a cultural goal. We were convinced, and we are convinced, that there is a scientific evidence and a practitioner's evidence, policymaking evidence, that unless culture is explicitly recognized in national development plans, in regional, local, sustainable development cannot take place because of the intrinsic values of culture and because of the connections that cultural actors, practices, activities have with other dimensions of development: environmental, urban planning, economic, social, of course, governance, symbolically. Well, UNESCO forgot about that in a month, but we, cities and local governments and the civil society, we wrote a document in September 2013 saying, look, this is how a culture goal could look like. We knew that this battle was lost from the very beginning, but we wanted to write that goal and to say to the world, we are here and we are convinced that this is the way the global development agenda should be shaped. Of course, the SDGs were approved in September 2015 without a culture goal, with several mentions: 11.4, 8.9, 8.3, 4.7, 10.2, 10.3, 16.10, etc. That's good. We are still struggling to have as much as possible the states, member states, the UN member states, when they report to the UN every month of July in their voluntary national reviews, to explain what are they doing with the Connection Culture SDGs. And we have just the Culture 2030 Goal campaign. We will upload a document, a vision document, saying that we will carry on this advocacy. We will carry on our say, watchdog role of analyzing the VNRs. Also, we will try to push cities and local governments when they are now writing VLRs, voluntary local reviews, that they include also the role of culture. So this is, yeah, this is something we will still care for. All what you have, or what you are discussing is extremely meaningful to us. Count on us. Make your own way. Let us stay connected, because what you are doing is certainly interesting for us, for other places around the world. I have seen Zayd have mentioned the Cultural Development Network in Australia, or the work of the Creative Cities Network in Canada. Culture Action Europe in Europe is doing similar work. So it is very good that we learn together, and that we find common language and common opportunities to advocate. But I think that this meeting is extraordinary.
Thank you so much, Jordi, and also welcome to your colleague Marta, who's also with you here. You're both very welcome, and we will count on you, because I think it is important to have the international environment that supports this sort of set out of ideas, and we definitely are being derivative from what you have developed. And certainly, Zayd took us through in detail the document you've done that outlines, how culture relates to each of the SDGs, and the examples. And both I mentioned and Rita then underscored the idea of starting to develop our own set of repository of evidence that starts supporting what is happening, even if people are not understanding how it links to SDGs. One of the roles, I think, of the work of the network would be to make more apparent how these examples actually start supporting the development and the realization of the SDG goals. And I think that's also one of the jobs of the network, is to advocate for how people are actually thinking culturally without recognizing or making explicit that they are thinking culturally, or where they're not thinking culturally with the lens of culture, how things can go terribly and horribly wrong. I think is equally valid and important.
All that you are commenting now resonates a lot with what we discussed 2 days ago at a session we had in UCLG. This is a session called Upgrading Culture in Sustainable Development. The time is now. And it was developed in the framework of the Cities Are Listening sessions organized by UCLG, UN Habitat, and Metropolis. So we had a lot of cities and partners and representatives from the civic society. We had all representatives from the Culture 2030 goal campaign. We had the city of Rome. We had Izmir, which is hosting the 4th edition of the UCLG Culture Summit in September. We had Buenos Aires, we had Bilbao, Lisbon, etc. And I would like to bring to the conversation here some of the main key learnings or takeaways of that session. And some of them were exactly what you said, the role of culture in the recovery, but also as a response to the main challenges of humanity now. So the issue of urban resilience was very present in the session, and I think that we were successful in making apparent, as you said, Avril, before, exactly how culture can contribute to the resilience strategies which are being built now. We had the presence of some artists that are currently working at the Orchestras for Transformation. It's an initiative developed in Rome by Rome City Council, which was really, really interesting. And it made really explicit that the relationship of culture with climate, but also it can be done in the same way with gender equality or with the economic recovery and with many other challenges. And also from a perspective of rights that have also been discussed here. We presented again, and we presented the main achievements of the Rome Charter, the 2020 Rome Charter. I will share with you the link now to this document, which is based on 5 capabilities that cities and local governments can enable for citizens to develop, which are discover, create, share, enjoy, and protect. So this rights-based perspective is really important to renew the social contract and to contribute to the Pact for the Future that UCLG is currently developing. And so I think that this may be useful and interesting for you and the network. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marta, for giving us that feedback from your meeting. And we have indeed in South Africa looked at the Rome Charter. We had a meeting, I think Jordi was one of our guests, and I think some of you were maybe in that meeting, where we explored the extent to which, and we had quite a lot of government officials in that meeting, both from DSAC, from COCTA, and so on. And it really was seen as a fundamentally important document because, number one, it is so short, 1 page, a 1-page policy document that somehow captures the very heart of what you said is this rights-based approach of what we want from culture and how you can think about it. And it provides the opportunity to infuse into it our own interpretation from this part of the world, because it is so generic and so large. It allows you, as whether it's South Africans or the SADC region or the African region, and I take that comment also very seriously, that a lot of us do work on the continent generally in terms of our own research and our own work with governments across the continent. It's not, but it is about playing. If we're going to make any difference, we have to understand and work with people at home. And I do think that I want to hand it over now to Zayd to say, well, what are some of the next steps that we could take as a fledgling, emerging network? Because I think we're going to need a few more sessions like this. This is not to conclude it at all, but it's to start a conversation and to also see who else wants to be in the room and who else wants to participate in this. And again, to keep that quite fluid so that we can move forward.